switching gears, talking about rendering, going over all the settings and all the basics of this. So before you even start with rendering, you really do need to have a basic understanding of your camera and how to position your camera, because basically rendering is just taking a snapshot of your camera's point of view. So in this mode, we're in viewport mode. In order to go into the camera view, you're going to hit the 0 on your keypad or the number pad, and that view right there is the view through this camera in the outliner. Just know that. And the problem though is if I move around, oops, I've now exited out of that view. So hitting 0 just frames it. If you want to actually change the camera's view, you need to lock this window and basically select the camera to look through. So in order to do that, hit N as in Nancy on your keyboard, go to your View tab, and choose Lock Camera to View. And when you do that, you get a red line around it. And now, if I move, I'm actually moving the camera. And the way to demonstrate this is if I go into the quad view mode on a PC, it's Control Alt and Q. Let's see if I can see where my camera is. So there's my camera. It's literally moving back and forth when I zoom in and zoom out. And if I move around the object, it's rotating. If I uncheck this lock camera to view and I try to do that, well, now I'm not moving the camera anymore. The camera is stationary and I'm in my viewport mode. So very important. All right, so I'm going to frame the scene like that. Go back into this mode. And now we're going to talk about render settings. Okay, so this is it. So if I wanted to simply render the scene default the way that it is when you open up Blender, you can just go up to the top of the screen and hit render, render image, or the keyboard shortcut is F12. All right, so now I've rendered the scene with all the default settings. Not so exciting, but that's how you render. And it matches the view that I've framed with the camera. So just to make sure this is very clear, if I change my view of my camera to look like this and I render the scene, it looks like that. All right, good. Okay, so let's look at the render settings. So if I go to this property on the right hand side that looks like the back of a camera, I've got a rendering engine called Eevee, which is the default rendering engine for Blender, and some settings called sampling. And the Eevee render engine is a basic rendering engine. It's very fast and it calculates some shadows, but not very high detail, and it's not used so much for photorealism. It's more for kind of animation, graphics, cartoony looking things. So let's make my scene a little more interesting and add a plane, scale it up, and I'll lower it. Okay, so okay, so in this scene here, I'm in solid mode, so I'm not really seeing much in terms of how it's going to render. Remember that I can go into my different modes here, material preview. I want to go into rendered mode, and rendered mode is going to right away show me the shadows that are being created by the rendering engine. So if I hit F12 and render the scene, I'm going to be now seeing it with the shadows being created. And the other thing to look at here is the sampling. So this is just saying how much detail, how much of the light it's calculating, shadows and things that it's sampling in your viewport, and how much it will do when it renders. You can leave these at the default. It's not going to make a whole lot of difference for what we're doing. We're going to play around with the other higher quality rendering engine called Cycles. So if you change the render engine to Cycles, you're going to notice that you've got this thing that's kind of redrawing and recalculating in real time. It's a little grainy looking, but the shadows are more realistic. The quality of the render is going to be much higher. In this case, it's telling you it's going to render 128 samples, and in the viewport it's showing 32. So you can play around with this. The other thing to notice is that what it's using in order to calculate the or process the render can be set to the processor unit, the CPU, or the graphics card. And I'll do a little demonstration. So on my computer here, I have a pretty powerful graphics card that will hopefully be faster than the CPU. So if I keep the default CPU and I render this scene as is at 1920 by 1080, it's going to use the processor unit and render it, and up here it's going to show the time. Let's see how long it takes in real time. Okay, so that took 23 seconds to render the scene using the processor unit. If I change it to my graphics card and I hit F12, we can see what the difference is. So 23 seconds was the last one, and this one was 9 seconds, 10 seconds almost. Okay, so cut the time in half plus some. So that's important. So if you do have a good graphics card and you can choose it, I would choose it. Remember that every time you restart Blender, this will be set back to default unless you save your preferences. So the other thing that can alter the time a lot is you can lower the rendering samples, and in something as simple as what we're doing here, it's not going to make any difference. You're not going to see the difference. So I'll just go ahead and demo that. We had 10 seconds before, and now I dropped the render samples down in half, and now it's at 5 seconds, so it cut the time in half. All right, so I'll leave that as so. All right, so the one more thing is to looking at the render resolution. So in the next tab down on your properties, you've got output properties. So we've got the resolution that it's going to render. The default is a standard HD rendering window, which is 1920 by 1080, and then a percentage. So the easiest way to, if you're doing things quickly and you want to see how your render's looking, you can of course change this to anything you want in terms of pixel dimensions. I could change it to 1000 pixels by 800 pixels. Oops, 800 pixels, and now I've got more of a wider or a less wide rectangle. You could do a square, right? 1000 by 1000 pixels, and you can also change the percentage of the render. So if I make this 50%, it's literally just going to render a 500 by 500 pixel, and it'll be very fast. Right, that happened in less than a second. So I'm going to set this to, I don't know, let's say 1500 by 1000 pixels for now, and I'm going to leave that percentage down to 50. Okay. So here has to do with animation, which frames you're animating. When we get to animating, we can talk about that. You don't need to worry too much about these other things in this section talking about rendering. All right, so one last thing I may as well cover here is this thing about denoising. So it should be very clear that when you, actually let me render this higher quality. When you render a scene using the Cycles renderer, you do get high quality shadows, you do get a lot of nice light bouncing around, but you also get noise by default. And the newest version of Blender allows you to simply click a button and you can soften that noise and maintain your other detail. It's called denoising. It's basically noise reduction. So super easy to do. You just go to the view layer properties button. Always have a hard time finding this. So it's this button here, view layer properties. And if you minimize any of the other windows and you scroll down, very bottom, there's a choice called denoising. There are settings in here that you can play with, strength and things like that, but the default is fairly good for our level of doing things. So I'm going to go ahead and render this scene now with denoising on, which does take longer to process. And it is much softer. It gets rid of all that grain, and it's pretty nice. So I would recommend clicking on the denoising. So that's pretty much it for the basics of rendering. So just quick review with this window, your render properties, you can choose between cycles or EV. One is faster than the other. You can use your graphics card if it's a faster graphics card, play around with the sampling. You can, of course, change any of the resolution of your renders here in the output properties, and then you can make sure that you check denoising in the view layers properties tab. So you got those three tabs to play with your basics of rendering your scene. All right.